The air inside the old mansion felt heavier than usual that morning, as if the walls themselves knew what was coming. Dust motes floated in the sunlight, filtering through the high-arched windows of the study where the family gathered. It was the first time they had all been under the same roof since Grandpa Thomas's 80th birthday, and even then, it had ended in arguments. Now, only the faint scent of old books and the echo of memories filled the silence. They came dressed in black, each with a different shade of grief, or perhaps guilt, painted on their faces. There was Richard, the eldest son, always the businessman, his jaw set, his eyes sharp even behind the guise of mourning. Beside him sat his wife, Margaret, with her perfectly folded hands and a calculating stillness that spoke louder than words. Across from them, Emily, the middle child, dabbed her eyes repeatedly, though no tears seemed to fall. She had always been the emotional one, but there was something forced about it this time, as though she knew the performance mattered. Then there was the youngest, Daniel. He arrived last, his clothes slightly wrinkled, his hair a little unkempt, like someone who had stopped caring long ago. The others had long dismissed him. The failure, the black sheep. He'd spent the last few years away from the family, surviving on odd jobs after a falling out that no one liked to talk about. Now, his presence alone stirred quiet murmurs, and sitting a little apart from them all was Lily, Grandpa's caretaker for the last 5 years. She wasn't family by blood, but she'd been closer to him than anyone else in his final days. Her expression was unreadable, her hands clasped tightly around the simple pendant Grandpa had given her last Christmas. The family rarely acknowledged her, except for quick glances filled with suspicion. When Mr. Harris, the family lawyer, entered with a thick folder, the sound of his shoes against the polished floor broke the tension. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began to read the last will and testament of Thomas Whitmore, patriarch, self-made millionaire, and father of 3. The first few lines were standard condolences, acknowledgments, and the legal declarations. But as Mr. Harris's tone deepened, the air seemed to change. Richard leaned forward slightly. Margaret's lips parted. Emily's fingers froze mid-motion. Daniel looked down, almost expecting what was coming. And then the words that changed everything echoed through the room. I, Thomas Whitmore, being of sound mind, do hereby leave the entirety of my estate, assets, and holdings, including the Whitmore mansion, all financial accounts and business shares, to my grandson, Daniel Whitmore. Silence. A long, stunned silence that felt like the world had stopped breathing. Richard was the first to stir, his knuckles whitening against the armrest. Emily blinked rapidly, as if trying to process the words. Margaret turned toward the lawyer, her mouth opening but no sound emerging. Lily's head snapped up in disbelief, eyes darting toward Daniel, who sat frozen, as if the ground beneath him had disappeared. Mr. Harris continued reading, his voice unwavering despite the storm he had unleashed. There were conditions, of course. The will was to be executed immediately, with no contestation allowed unless one wished to forfeit their share of the personal trust left for family support. But it was clear Daniel was now the heir to everything. The mansion, the company, the fortune. All belonged to the one person they had cast out. When the reading ended, no one spoke. The lawyer packed his papers and quietly excused himself, leaving behind an echo of his own footsteps. That was when the first cracks began to show. Richard's expression hardened into something dangerous. Emily clutched her pearl necklace. Trembling, Margaret whispered something under her breath, a venomous sound that made even Lily flinch. Daniel stood slowly, his mind a haze of disbelief. He wanted to ask why. He wanted to say this had to be a mistake, that Grandpa wouldn't have done this, not after everything. But deep down, a small part of him, the part that had been humiliated, ignored, and dismissed for years, felt a spark of something else, not triumph, not joy, something darker. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. A storm was coming, both outside and within the family. That evening, the Whitmore mansion felt colder than ever. The family dispersed to their rooms, each carrying their own thoughts. Thoughts not of grief, but of vengeance, confusion, and greed. Lily lingered in the hallway, looking at a portrait of Grandpa Thomas. His painted eyes seemed to follow her, calm and knowing, as if he had planned all of this deliberately. In Daniel's old bedroom, untouched since he left years ago, he sat on the edge of the bed and stared out the window. Memories came flooding back, of harsh words, slammed doors, and the night he was told he was no longer a Whitmore. He had left with nothing but his pride, and now fate had dragged him back with everything. He whispered to himself, not words of celebration, but a quiet promise. To understand why. To uncover what his grandfather had seen, what he had known that the rest of them didn't. But in the hallway outside, someone was listening. Margaret's silhouette lingered near the door, her face hidden in shadow. She had already made up her mind. There was no way this would stand. Not if she had anything to say about it. As the rain began to fall, washing over the darkened estate, a strange stillness settled over the Whitmore house. None of them knew it yet, but Grandpa Thomas had left behind more than just a fortune. He had left behind secrets. The kind that could destroy them all. And by the time the truth came out, not everyone would make it through unscathed. The morning after the storm dawned gray and tense, the mansion wrapped in silence so heavy it felt like a warning. The air smelled faintly of rain and something metallic, perhaps the scent of old secrets being disturbed. Daniel barely slept after discovering the open safe, his thoughts racing between disbelief and dread. The will was gone, the portrait slightly askew, and no sign of forced entry, only that cold emptiness where his grandfather's final words should have been. He didn't tell anyone right away. A strange instinct told him to wait, to observe. In this house, truth was rarely what it seemed. Over breakfast, he watched the others carefully. Richard appeared calm, perhaps too calm, reading the newspaper with mechanical precision. Margaret stirred her tea without touching it, her mind clearly elsewhere. Emily avoided everyone's eyes, while Lily seemed unusually withdrawn, her gaze darting toward the hallway every few minutes. No one mentioned the will. No one mentioned Grandpa. The only sound was the soft clink of silverware and the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock. Later that morning, Daniel slipped into the study. The safe was still open, but now it was empty, cleaned out. Not just the will, but several old ledgers, a stack of photographs, and a small black notebook that Daniel remembered his grandfather guarding closely. His heart sank. Someone had taken them deliberately. Grandpa's voice echoed in his memory. One day you'll understand, Daniel. Some things are meant to come to light slowly. He had thought it was just one of the old man's cryptic lessons. But now it felt like a warning. Daniel began searching through the study for clues. Drawers, old letters, anything that might explain what his grandfather had done. He found fragments of old correspondence, business deals, notes scribbled in the margins, a few yellowed photographs. One photo caught his attention. Grandpa Thomas standing beside a woman Daniel didn't recognize, her hand resting on his shoulder, a faint smile on her lips. The back of the photo had only one word written: forgive. Meanwhile, upstairs, Richard was on the phone, his voice low and tense. He was speaking to someone Daniel didn't know. A lawyer, perhaps, or one of his father's old associates. From behind the slightly open door, Margaret listened, her fingers tapping against the wooden frame. Richard was planning to contest the will after all, despite the clause forbidding it. He had discovered a loophole, he said, something about testamentary competence and mental decline. Margaret smiled faintly. If the will could be invalidated, everything would revert to the natural heirs, and Daniel would lose everything again. But what neither of them knew was that Lily had overheard. She had been passing by with a tray of tea, her steps light as always, but her ears sharp. She had seen too much over the years to be naive now. Grandpa had trusted her, truly trusted her, and she had promised him something on the night he died. That night replayed in her mind constantly. The way he had grabbed her hand, his voice faint but urgent. He had spoken of the family, of lies buried under years of greed. He had said that the truth would come out after he was gone, that Daniel would be the one to set things right. And then he had asked her to protect something in the house. But he hadn't said what. In the evening, Daniel went to the attic, the one place no one liked to enter. It was filled with the remnants of the past, broken furniture, old portraits, boxes of forgotten possessions. Dust covered everything, but the air felt strangely alive, as if memories lingered here. He opened a few boxes, finding stacks of papers and old family records, and then, tucked beneath an old blanket, he found a wooden chest. The lock was rusted, but it wasn't difficult to pry open. Inside were dozens of envelopes, each labeled with a name: Richard, Emily, Margaret, Lily, and one addressed to Daniel. His hands trembled as he opened his. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a few words written in Grandpa's shaky handwriting. You must find the truth before they destroy it. His chest tightened. The words were vague but filled with urgency. He looked through the others, hesitating. Was he ready to see what Grandpa had written about them? Curiosity won over caution. He opened Richard's first. Inside was a photocopy of a document, an old business contract, signed years ago. But at the bottom was a handwritten note from Grandpa. You stole what was never yours. Next was Emily's envelope. It contained a faded letter, an apology, dated 20 years ago from someone named Sarah. The words hinted at a child, at secrets kept quiet to protect reputations. Daniel's mind spun. Who was Sarah? What child? Margaret's envelope was heavier. It contained photographs, ones that made Daniel's stomach turn. Pictures of her meeting someone in secret, the same man who had once tried to sue Grandpa's company into bankruptcy. A betrayal, years in the making. He stopped when he reached Lily's envelope. His hand shook slightly. Inside was only a single line written in neat, careful handwriting, "Trust her." The Daniel sat there for a long time, the wind howling softly outside, as puzzle pieces began to form an outline of something much larger. His grandfather had known everything. The lies, the theft, the betrayals. The will wasn't a mistake, it was a message. A final act of justice disguised as inheritance. Downstairs, Margaret poured herself a drink, her mind working through possibilities. She had seen the way Daniel looked at everyone, the suspicion in his eyes. He knew something. That meant he was dangerous. She couldn't afford to let him stay in control of the estate or the secrets. And as the clock struck midnight, Daniel was startled by the sound of footsteps coming up the attic stairs. Slurful. He turned toward the door, heart pounding. "Who's there?" he called instinctively, though no answer came. The footsteps stopped just outside. Then, the faint creak of the floorboards and a shadow moved under the door. He took a step forward, reaching for the nearest object, an old lamp. The handle turned slowly, and for a moment, he thought it was Richard, or maybe Lily. But then the door opened wider, and the figure stepped into the dim light. It wasn't family. It was a stranger, tall, dressed in black, holding the missing black notebook. The stranger's presence filled the attic like a shadow that didn't belong. The dim light from the small window caught the edges of his coat, the gleam of rainwater dripping from it, and the black notebook clutched in his hand, the very one that had vanished from the safe. Daniel froze, his pulse hammering in his throat. The man's words echoed in his head like a storm. "Your grandfather sent me." It made no sense. Grandpa had been dead for a week, but the certainty in the man's tone, the way he said it, as though Thomas Whitmore's will reached beyond the grave, left Daniel breathless. The man placed the notebook on the dusty table, then turned toward the window, looking out as if checking for eyes watching from below. The sound of rain against the glass filled the silence. Without a word, he pointed to the notebook and gestured for Daniel to open it. Inside, the first page bore Grandpa's handwriting, shaky but unmistakable. "If you are reading this, Daniel, it means they've already begun to turn on each other. Do not trust appearances. The truth lies buried beneath what they built together." Daniel turned the pages slowly. Each section was filled with names, dates, transactions, and notes about the family. It wasn't just a notebook. It was a record. Grandpa's private journal of the family's corruption, manipulation, and betrayals. Years of deceit meticulously documented in his steady hand. One entry caught Daniel's eye. Dated just 6 months before Grandpa's death, "Margaret is not who she pretends to be. She knows what Richard did. Emily is living a lie built on guilt. I must make sure Daniel is protected when I'm gone. The others cannot be allowed to destroy him like they destroyed everything else." Daniel's stomach twisted as he read further. Each page was worse than the last. Richard had embezzled funds from their father's company for over a decade, hiding the losses by forging documents. Emily had covered for him once, in exchange for hush money that kept her quiet but broke her inside. Margaret had been the architect behind it all, manipulating, blackmailing, and turning each sibling against the other, ensuring her influence stayed intact no matter who held power. And Grandpa had known. He had seen it all. The stranger stepped closer, his voice a low rumble now. "He left this for you. He knew you'd be the only one who would look past the lies. He wanted you to finish what he started." Daniel's mind reeled. Finish what he started. But what did that mean? Revenge? Justice? Exposure? The line between them was thin. The stranger handed him a small key, old brass, with an ornate W engraved at the top. "It opened something," he said quietly. "Something your grandfather wanted hidden until the right time. Find it before they do." And just like that, the stranger turned and left, his footsteps fading into the echoing hall below. By the time Daniel reached the bottom of the stairs, he was gone. No sound of a car, no closing door, as if he had vanished into the storm itself. Daniel stood alone in the grand hallway, holding the key and the notebook. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch him. Generations of Whitmores, their painted faces frozen in judgment. He looked up at Grandpa's portrait, the one that once concealed the safe. The old man's eyes seemed almost alive in the dim light, full of secrets he was still unwilling to share. That night, Daniel locked himself in the study and read every word of the notebook. The more he read, the more he understood the depth of his family's betrayal. Grandpa hadn't written a will to reward him. He'd written it as a weapon, to force the truth into the open. He had known that greed would expose them faster than justice ever could. Meanwhile, in her bedroom, Margaret pored over her own plans. She had convinced Richard to move quickly. The legal challenge had already been filed in secret, using old medical records suggesting Grandpa's mental decline. Emily had agreed to testify, guilt eating away at her resolve, but Margaret had a way of twisting her weakness into compliance. But something else was bothering Margaret now. She had noticed Daniel in the attic earlier, and she had heard the footsteps. Someone else had been there. Someone not from the family. And she didn't like unknown variables. The next morning, Daniel began searching the house for a lock that fit the brass key. Every drawer, every door, every hidden compartment he could find. But nothing matched. It wasn't until late afternoon, when Lily appeared quietly in the doorway, that he thought to ask. She looked pale, her eyes rimmed with red. "You shouldn't be in here," she said softly. "They're watching you." Daniel studied her. "You knew about this, didn't you? About what Grandpa was doing?" Lily hesitated, then nodded. "He didn't tell me everything, but he said you'd need help. There's something under the East Wing, a place he used to go alone. The East Wing, sealed off for years after a fire decades ago. It had always been off limits. But if Grandpa had hidden something there, as night fell, Daniel and Lily made their way down the narrow hallway, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The wallpaper was peeling, the air thick with dust. At the end of the hall stood a door with a heavy lock. Daniel tried the brass key. It turned smoothly. The door creaked open to reveal a small, windowless room, cold and silent. Inside, there was only a single object, a safe built into the wall, older than the rest of the mansion, its metal dulled with age. Above it, engraved faintly, were the words "E. The truth sets free." The key didn't fit this time. Instead, Daniel noticed a small indentation beside the lock, the shape of a pendant. Lily froze, slowly. She reached for the pendant around her neck. The one Grandpa had given her the Christmas before he died. "He told me to keep it safe," she whispered. "He said one day it would open the past." Her hands shook as she placed the pendant into the slot. A faint click echoed in the silence. The safe door released. Inside were documents, photographs, letters, and one small USB drive. Daniel took it out, the light catching the metallic surface. Labeled on it, in Grandpa's neat handwriting, were two words, the proof. Lily looked at him, terrified. "You need to be careful. If they find out what's on that drive, they'll stop at nothing." Daniel slipped the drive into his pocket, heart pounding. "Then it's time to find out what my family's really capable of." But before they could leave the room, they heard footsteps in the hall. Heavy, deliberate, growing closer. Lily's face went pale. "Someone's coming." Daniel turned off the flashlight, his heart racing. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. A hand tried the knob, found it locked, then slowly withdrew. Then a voice spoke through the wood, calm, cold, unmistakable. "Richard, Daniel?" he said, almost gently. "I think it's time we talked about the will." The metallic click echoed through the small hidden room like thunder trapped in stone. Daniel's breath caught as Richard's voice, calm but edged with something sinister, drifted through the door again. "You've been busy, haven't you, little brother?" His tone was eerily composed, the kind that carried danger behind politeness. Daniel didn't move. Lily pressed herself against the cold wall, her trembling fingers clutching her pendant, now missing its centerpiece, the piece that had opened the safe. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, until Richard spoke again, quieter this time. "You know, Father always said curiosity was a dangerous thing in this family." He was right. Then came the sound of retreating footsteps. Slow, steady, deliberate. Daniel exhaled shakily. He knew his brother too well. Richard wasn't giving up. He was planning his next move. Once the house fell silent again, Daniel and Lily slipped out of the room, locking it behind them. They crept down the corridor, their footsteps muffled by the dust and rot of the forgotten wing. When they reached the main hall, the lights were out, all of them. The mansion stood in darkness, lit only by flashes of lightning from outside. Daniel clutched the USB drive in his pocket. Whatever was on it, his grandfather had wanted it hidden, and that meant it could destroy someone. Perhaps all of them. In the study, Daniel powered up the old computer that still sat on Grandpa's desk. It groaned to life, the monitor flickering with faint light. Lily stood near the window, her gaze fixed on the long driveway where faint headlights appeared for a second, then vanished. When the desktop loaded, Daniel inserted the USB drive. A single folder appeared labeled C5AAL. Inside were dozens of video files, each named by date. He clicked the first one. The screen came alive with a familiar view, Grandpa's office. The footage was from a hidden camera. Grandpa sat behind his desk, facing someone off-screen. His voice, though older and slower, carried authority. "You think I don't know Richard? Every missing dollar, every false account, all of it leads back to you." Daniel froze. Richard's voice responded faintly through the recording, defensive and angry. The conversation grew heated. Then another video, Emily's voice, tearful, confessing to covering up financial records. Another clip showed Margaret in a dimly lit cafe, handing an envelope of cash to a man Daniel recognized as their father's rival. Each video was a confession, proof of everything. Grandpa hadn't just known, he had recorded it all. Daniel's hands trembled as realization set in. This was the truth his grandfather wanted him to find. This was why the fortune had gone to him, to make sure justice was done, not through revenge, but exposure. But then he clicked the last video. The date was only 2 weeks before Grandpa's death. In it, Grandpa sat alone, looking weaker, his breathing shallow. "If you're watching this, Daniel," he said into the camera, "it means I didn't die naturally. They'll tell you it was the heart. But the heart doesn't stop without reason. Someone wanted me silent, and I know who." Daniel's pulse raced. The old man's eyes seemed to look straight through the screen, heavy with both sorrow and certainty. "Trust Lily. Protect her. She knows what comes next." Lily turned from the window, eyes wide, tears welling. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew they'd kill him." Before Daniel could respond, the power cut out. The monitor went black, plunging them into darkness. A sound came from the hallway. Footsteps again, heavier this time, not one pair, but two. Lily grabbed Daniel's arm. "We need to go. Now." They moved quickly through the shadows, down the servants' staircase that wound to the cellar. The house above them creaked and groaned with movement. Whispers, hurried steps, doors opening and closing. Someone was searching for them. In the cellar, Daniel found the old generator and powered a dim light. Shelves lined the walls, old wine bottles, crates of forgotten furniture, and a single-locked cabinet. The keyhole caught his eye. He tried the brass key it fit. Inside was a small metal box wrapped in cloth. When Daniel opened it, he found another letter, addressed in Grandpa's hand. "To whoever still believes in truth." He read it aloud, his voice low. Grandpa wrote about the family's moral decay, how love had turned into greed, and how his own guilt had festered for letting it happen. He admitted he'd built his fortune on ruthless decisions, and that perhaps his final act, the will, was his way of making amends. "If they choose revenge, they will destroy themselves. But if you choose truth, Daniel, you might save what's left of our name." Daniel folded the letter carefully. It wasn't just an inheritance. It was a burden, one that demanded courage instead of vengeance. Above them, glass shattered. A door slammed open. Voices filled the air. Richard's, sharp and furious, and Margaret's, cold and commanding. Lily's eyes widened. "They found us." Daniel grabbed the USB drive and the letter, shoving them into his pocket. They sprinted toward the side entrance that led to the gardens, the cold night air cutting into their lungs. Lightning illuminated the wet grass, the long hedges, the twisting shadows of the estate grounds. They reached the edge of the property when headlights flared in the distance, a car blocking the only exit. Richard stepped out, holding a gun, his face set in grim determination. "End of the line, Daniel," he said, his voice steady, the storm whipping around them. "You should have stayed away." Lily froze beside him. Daniel's mind raced. The truth was in his pocket, but now survival was all that mattered. "Hand it over," Richard said, gesturing with the gun. "Whatever he left you. The notebook, the drive, all of it." Daniel's hand hovered near his coat. The weight of the drive felt like destiny, heavy, inevitable. He glanced at Lily. She shook her head almost imperceptibly. A single flash of lightning revealed another figure behind Richard. Margaret, her hand reaching into her purse. But before Daniel could react, 2 gunshots split the night. The first came from Richard's hand, the second from Margaret's. Richard staggered backward, shock frozen on his face. The gun slipped from his grasp, landing in the mud. Margaret stood there, her hand trembling, smoke curling from her weapon. Her voice cracked, barely audible through the storm. "You always were too predictable, Richard." Daniel stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. Richard fell to his knees, his breath shallow, eyes locked on his brother. She'll do the same to you," he whispered, before collapsing. The rain washed over his body as the sound of sirens, distant but growing, cut through the thunder. Margaret turned toward Daniel, her expression empty, her voice calm. "You have no idea what you've started." The storm had passed by morning, but its echo lingered in the damp air, carried through the mansion's shattered windows and broken silence. Police cars crowded the circular driveway, their flashing lights painting the gray stone walls in red and blue. The Whitmore estate, once a monument to power and prestige, now looked like a crime scene from a tragedy long foretold. Richard Whitmore was dead. The once proud heir lay cold in the mud, his blood washed clean by the rain that refused to stop. Margaret stood nearby, her expression unreadable as she told the police her version of events. That Richard had gone mad, that he'd tried to shoot Daniel, that she had acted to protect her family. She was calm, almost rehearsed. Daniel watched from the steps of the mansion, his body numb, his thoughts spinning in chaos. The USB drive pressed against his thigh like a heartbeat, reminding him of what he still carried. The truth. The proof of every crime, every secret, every lie. The thing his grandfather had built the will around. Lily stood beside him, pale and trembling, but silent. Her eyes followed the officers as they marked the scene, took photos, and whispered quietly among themselves. None of them seemed to question Margaret's story. After all, she was the grieving widow of the family patriarch's eldest son, poised and composed. Daniel, in contrast, looked like the outcast, the fortunate grandson who had inherited everything after a suspicious death and another shooting. As the coroner's van left the property, Margaret approached. Her tone was soft, her movement slow, as if she were approaching a wounded animal. "You need rest, Daniel," she said quietly, the faintest trace of sympathy in her voice. "This has been traumatic for all of us. Let me handle the authorities. They'll only twist your words." He didn't respond. He could barely look at her without hearing Richard's last words. "She'll do the same to you." That night, the mansion felt emptier than ever. The staff had left, the police tape fluttered in the wind outside, and the halls were heavy with the scent of candle wax and decay. Daniel sat alone in Grandpa's study, staring at the blank computer screen. The USB drive lay on the desk before him, small and unassuming, yet powerful enough to destroy everything. He turned it in his hand, his mind caught between fear and fury. Margaret's words played over in his head. Her calm, her confidence, her control. She was too composed, too sure of what would happen next. And that made him realize something. This wasn't chaos. It was orchestration. The will wasn't the trap. He was. Grandpa's fortune, the revelations, the staged inheritance. They were all parts of a puzzle he hadn't yet solved. And if Margaret was right, if he really was just the bait, then someone else was pulling the strings. Upstairs, Emily sobbed softly in her room. She hadn't come out since the shooting. Lily tried to comfort her, but Emily barely spoke. When Daniel passed her door, he heard her muttering through the walls, fragments of guilt, fear, and something darker. It wasn't supposed to go this far. He promised no one would die. Daniel froze. He promised. Who was she talking about? The next morning, Daniel woke to find Lily gone. Her bed was empty, her things untouched. Panic surged through him as he searched the house, calling her name. In the kitchen, a folded note waited on the counter. "Don't look for me. They'll come for you next. Find the truth before they find you. L." His stomach turned cold. He checked the security footage, but all the cameras were offline. Someone had cut the feed during the night. He ran to the study, his hands shaking, and opened the safe behind the portrait. The notebook was gone. The proof, everything, gone. except the USB drive. He slipped it into his pocket again, a sense of urgency flooding him. The only way to stop this, to survive this, was to expose the truth himself. He couldn't trust anyone now. Not the police, not Emily, not even Lily if she had turned under pressure. But as he walked past the grand staircase, he stopped. Something was off. The family portrait hanging above it, the one painted when he was a child, was slightly crooked. He adjusted it on instinct, and behind it, something clicked. A hidden compartment. Inside was a small envelope marked with his name. Inside it a single flash drive, identical to the one in his pocket. But when he compared the two, one was labeled Proof, the other read Confession. Daniel plugged in the second drive. A video opened automatically. The screen flickered to life with the image of Margaret sitting in Grandpa's office, her face sharp and cold. She spoke directly to the camera, her voice smooth and deliberate. "If you're watching this," she said, "then everything has gone according to plan." Daniel's heart pounded. "For years, your grandfather believed he could manipulate us, pit us against each other, teach us lessons through cruelty. He thought his little game of morality would end with redemption." Her lips curled in disdain. "I never understood that we stopped believing in redemption a long time ago." She leaned closer to the camera. The inheritance, the secrets, the so-called proof, they were all part of his design. But he underestimated me. I made sure the right documents disappeared, the right people turned on each other. Even Richard, poor Richard. He was meant to be the scapegoat. Daniel's chest tightened. Margaret continued, "You were the final piece, Daniel. The innocent one. The one he thought could save us. That's why he gave it all to you. So you'd dig, so you'd uncover his little sins and ours. But the more you dig, the deeper the grave becomes. And when it's done, all they'll see is the greedy grandson who inherited everything and killed for it." The screen flickered. Margaret's face came closer, almost whispering now. "You think you hold the truth, Daniel. But by the time you try to share it, no one will believe you. Because they already believe me." The video ended abruptly. Daniel sat frozen, the room spinning. It wasn't just revenge, it was entrapment. Every event, the will, the missing documents, the shooting, was orchestrated to frame him. He ran to the window. Down the long driveway, police cars were pulling up again. But this time, there were more of them. Emily stood outside with an officer, her face streaked with tears. She was pointing toward the mansion. Toward him. Daniel's mind went blank. Margaret had already moved the pieces into place. He could see it now, the inevitable end of Grandpa's game. As the officers approached the front door, Daniel grabbed the two drives, Proof and Confession, and bolted through the back exit into the woods behind the estate. Rain began to fall again, washing over the earth like fate itself. Behind him, through the thunder, he could hear Margaret's voice calling after him. Calm, composed, victorious. "Run all you like, Daniel," she said, her voice echoing through the storm. "You're already guilty." The forest was deathly quiet, save for the faint hum of the rain as it filtered through the trees. Daniel's breath came in quick, panicked bursts as he dropped to his knees beside Lily. Her skin was cold, her clothes soaked through, and the faint glint of the flash drive in her hand shimmered under the weak beam of his flashlight. "Lily," he whispered, shaking her gently. Her eyelids fluttered, barely opening, and a faint groan escaped her lips. Relief flooded through him. She was alive but weak. He scanned the woods around them. The flashing red and blue lights from the mansion were distant now, barely visible through the thick mist. For the first time since Grandpa's death, Daniel felt completely alone, hunted, framed, and unsure who he could trust. But Lily had the third flash drive. The real will. He slipped it from her trembling fingers, shielding it from the rain. Whatever was on it had cost blood already. And now, he knew it held the final key to everything. The truth his grandfather had buried so carefully, waiting for the right moment to surface. "Lily," he said softly, leaning close. "Did Grandpa give you this?" Her lips moved weakly. "Safe. Not what it seems." Her words trailed off into a shiver. Daniel wrapped his jacket around her and looked toward the distant road. He had one option left, the old caretaker's cottage at the edge of the property, where the electricity still worked and where Grandpa used to go to. Think. It was hidden, off any path the police might search. He lifted Lily carefully and carried her through the trees, every step echoing in the wet earth. By the time they reached the cottage, dawn was beginning to break. a dull gray light washing over the estate like the aftermath of a long war. Inside, he laid her on the couch and started the generator. The lights flickered weakly to life. He set up the laptop on a wooden table, inserted the flash drive, and waited. The drive opened to reveal a single video file, titled simply, "My Final Testament." Thomas Whitmore. Daniel's heart pounded as he clicked it. The video began with his grandfather sitting in the very same study where the will had been read. He looked tired, his skin pale, but his eyes were sharp. The eyes of a man who still had unfinished business. "If you're watching this," Grandpa began, "then my death has already divided you all as I feared it would. I knew it was coming, not by old age, but by design. I've lived long enough to see the rot in my own family grow unchecked. I built an empire on ambition and greed, and in doing so, I taught my children to worship power more than love." He leaned forward, voice trembling with regret. But what they never understood was that wealth is worthless without conscience. "I made mistakes, terrible ones. I used people. I destroyed friendships. And I let my family become poisoned by the same hunger that built this house." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. Lily stirred faintly, eyes fluttering open, watching the screen through blurred vision. "I knew they would fight when I died," Grandpa continued. "That's why I wrote the will the way I did. I gave everything to Daniel, not because he deserved the fortune, but because he deserved the truth. He was the only one untouched by their corruption, the only one who still had a chance to do what's right." He paused, breathing heavy. "But there's something none of them knew. The money, the estate, the company, none of it truly belongs to the Whitmores anymore. Years ago, I began transferring everything into a private trust, one that will be released only when the truth of this family is made public." Daniel's eyes widened. "The fortune," Grandpa said softly, "is tied to confession, not inheritance. Every secret, every crime, every act of betrayal must be revealed. Only then can what's left of this legacy be redeemed." A screen flickered. A faint sound echoed behind Grandpa in the video, a door opening, a whisper. He turned slightly, his voice lowering. "If you're watching this, Daniel, then I was right. They couldn't let me live." A shadow crossed the frame, faint but visible. A silhouette Daniel recognized immediately. Margaret, his blood ran cold. Grandpa's eyes looked directly into the camera one last time. "She'll twist the truth, Daniel. She always does. But remember, I left you the power to expose it all. The drives, the letters, the recordings, they're all copies. Everything she destroys will resurface if you're brave enough to release it." He hesitated, then smiled faintly, almost proudly. "You are my redemption. Don't let the darkness win again." The video ended abruptly. Daniel sat frozen. It all made sense now. The will wasn't a cruel joke or a game, it was a test, a moral reckoning. His grandfather hadn't just wanted to punish them, he had wanted to cleanse the family name through truth, not vengeance. But the knowledge came with a heavy price. He now held the proof that Margaret had killed Grandpa, and that every lie she told could be undone. But if he released it, the family name would be ruined forever. Lily's voice broke the silence. "You can't let her win, Daniel. He trusted you. All of this, the inheritance, the secrets, it wasn't to destroy them. It was to free you from them." Daniel looked at the drives on the table. Proof, confession, and the real will. 3 paths, 3 choices. If he destroyed them, he could walk away, start over, and let the past die. If he kept them hidden, Margaret would win, rewriting history once again. But if he released them, the Whitmore name would burn, along with everyone tied to it. He thought of Grandpa's eyes in that final video, tired, guilty, yet hopeful. Then, with trembling hands, Daniel gathered the drives and connected them all to the laptop. He uploaded every file, every video, every letter, and sent them. To the press, to the authorities, to the public. The truth would no longer belong to the Whitmores. It would belong to the world. By the time the upload finished, dawn had turned to full morning. Police sirens wailed again in the distance, this time not coming for Daniel, but for Margaret. Lily sat beside him, watching as he closed the laptop. "It's over," she whispered. But Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, it's only over when the truth lives longer than the lies." Hours later, as news reports flooded the airwaves, the world learned everything about the fraud, the manipulation, the murder. Margaret was taken away in handcuffs, her calm composure finally cracking under the weight of exposure. Emily vanished from sight, too ashamed to face the cameras. The Whitmore name, once synonymous with power, became a warning of greed and corruption. Weeks passed. The mansion was sold to charity, the estate liquidated. Most of the money went into the trust Grandpa had built, now transformed into a foundation for victims of corporate fraud, his final act of redemption. And Daniel, the heir who never wanted a fortune, left the city behind. He carried nothing with him but the pendant Lily had once worn and a letter Grandpa had hidden at the very end of his journal. One line written in his familiar hand. In the end, Daniel, the richest man, is the one who can sleep without guilt. As Daniel walked down the quiet country road, the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of rain and old memories. The weight of the past was still there, but lighter now, as if Grandpa's spirit had finally been freed from the mansion's shadow. He didn't look back. The Whitmore legacy was over. But the truth would live forever,